They speak the same language as we do, but there are many different people who are in different parts of the advocacy world who are actually different from us. And we tend not to deal with them. Well, I'm here to tell you, if you're going to be a true change agent, you have to be thinking of everybody who is advocating in your sector where it's near to government, academics, people who are street-level advocates who are doing something that you might not agree with, but you should be getting together with everybody, and I call that having the vertical conversation. So think about having that vertical conversation, and the way you know you're having it is that people don't talk like you and they don't dress like you. They may not be the same age. So think outside in. It's amazing how many organizations do not understand who don't understand how they're seen by others. They only think that they have their small little group. You talk again to the people, you talk to yourselves, and then you don't realize how people outside see you. I think true change agents are always aware of how they're seen from the outside. And remember that when governments are doing options, they will always have an option that says maintain status quo or do nothing. And believe me, that is the option most often chosen. As a result, you should always know what the consequences of inaction are. And I always teach this in my policy course. And now I have a new hero in Al Gore because he did a 2-hour PowerPoint movie where all he talked about was the consequences of inaction. And he got a Nobel Prize and Academy Award. So it's very important when somebody says, well, what will happen if we don't do what you're asking? And have people saying, well, I never really thought of that before because all I've been doing is advocating for what we want. One more? Okay. So here's some tips. Rethink the ambush press release. And that's where you put something out without talking to people. Work with journalists in advance. Float your recommendations within government, something I always do. Always do it. Plan for a Monday release. It's the best day to do it. Give journalists, policy analysts a chance to advise you. Don't keep things away from them in advance. And remember, you're getting good free advice. And always think about the good of your ask. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. And our final speaker is Rick Wolff, president of Poststone Corporation, a Toronto research consultancy. He creates and implements programs that help organizations connect with their clients, change the way they make decisions, and project an image that matches their objectives. He's been a guest on CBC, CTV, and BNN. Rick?
Thank you, Carol. So Judy told us that at NAC they learned to start off by sharing with everybody how they feel. Well, hello, Joanna, nice to see you. I feel delighted to see an old friend. And I also feel incredibly humbled to be in a room full of change agents and asked to speak about being a change agent. I feel terrified to be following two such experienced and thought-provoking speakers. So with that, a deep breath and here goes. What Carol didn't mention is that I mostly work with banks. And you know, people don't go to work in a bank if they want a lot of change. So that's how I've learned to change. I think I've read one book. No, I think I've read 2 books about change. I've like you, I have been exposed to some wonderful tools of change. But 99% of what I know about change, I have learned working with banks and law firms and other giant corporations that crave, as John said, the option of inaction. Everybody is thrilled by the option of inaction. But yet, there is one person or one leader who wants to see a big change, and so we get called. So what I'd like to share with you today are a few of the things, just 3 things that I've learned in the course of working with these organizations in making something happen in a world where people would prefer that things stayed just as they are. And the first, what I'd like you to notice as I tell you give you these 3 examples, is that you are all already doing all of this. And also, pretty much everything I have to describe has already been illustrated in what we've heard from Judy and from John. So here goes. The one last thing I should mention before diving in is that also, like everybody here, the most profound influences for me about how to change are the influences I've seen in my own family, my parents and my grandparents, and watching what they did, how they brought about change. And it all comes down to 3 things. We need to be caring observers. We need to be engineers. And I mean that quite literally. Even though we're not working with steel or not working with chemicals or not working with roads and buildings, we do need to be engineers in order to do change. And then lastly, we need to be storytellers. And since I knew I was going to say we need to be storytellers, I kept count of the number of stories we've heard so far today, starting with Trudy and then Minister Finley and on from there. My count was 13 stories so far. And think about how you use stories, but we'll come back to that. So that first role, the caring observer, and the first thing I'll point out was John's point about listening. And Judy also told a story about listening, a wonderful story about listening, the story of the president of Bolivia, and how profound, and in fact, that is a story of 2 things. It is a story of listening, but it's also a story of engineering, because he created change by being seen to listen. And people behaved differently afterwards because he was seen to listen. So what does the observer do? What does the caring observer do? You look, you listen, you report, you take careful note, you gather the facts, you use all of that to make sure that you are moving in the right direction, to make sure that you are attending to the perspectives of the people you're working with. Then we get to, one wonderful experience from my own career. This wasn't in a bank, but it was a giant Canadian company, a company that everybody here does business with. And it was at a very unhappy point in the company's history. We were going across Canada talking with employees. And one dialogue session, 2 hours long, we were asking them a number of questions to get a better feel of the situation from their perspective. They were unbelievably unhappy. They had nothing but complaints for the 2 hours, and every single one of their complaints was fair. I couldn't disagree with a single thing they complained about. And one of my colleagues, at the very end of the session, one of my colleagues said, "So what would have to happen to change things?" And the answer was, "Oh, more sessions like this." That, too, speaks to the power of being a caring observer. So from there, I've said that a change agent has to be an engineer. And in addition to the wonderful example of the president of Bolivia, I'd like to use an example from Jeb Brugman's book, Welcome to the Urban Revolution, How Cities Are Changing the World. Jeb is an American who moved to Canada to Toronto many years ago, but he travels all over the world studying emerging cities and their strategic issues. And he has a story about Mary Ann Smith, who was an alderman in Chicago. And let me read you his story. It'll describe the problem and, in my view, how she thought like an engineer in order to solve the problem, and how she found leverage. My first 2 years in office were all about crime. We tracked crime by address to identify the problem corners in buildings. In order to get the police to patrol these areas, I had to sit in a lawn chair at the most crime-ridden corners. I'd call the police in advance to tell them where I would be, and this would force the police to do a sweep of the area before I got there so I wouldn't be harmed. I don't know a better story about change. That story captures the core of my philosophy of change. she had no resources other than her visibility as an alderman. No, that's not true. She did do an analysis. So she had data, being a caring observer, and she had her pulpit of being an alderman, and that was it. And using those two resources, she figured out where to sit, she called the police, and she went and sat. And in doing that, she created change. So the last piece, the storytelling, and 13 stories before I got to the stage. And again, think about your own experience. Think about the ways that you were using stories. In my case, before going into business, I had a former life. I used to direct plays. And so, as you can imagine, that gave me a bias towards stories. And it also gave me an opportunity, as a director, telling stories to the cast, gave me an opportunity to practice telling stories. And I can tell you that notwithstanding that bias and notwithstanding that practice, I have found in business that I have to choose my stories very, very carefully and practice them and practice them and practice them, and that there are enormous rewards for that practice. I should also say that Armin Yalnizyan, who has been mentioned already, she played piano on stage in one of the very first shows I ever directed about 30 years ago, so more than 30 years ago. So it is a very small world. I'd just like to tell a story to illustrate. Here's a story from my own family, from my mother and father. After they had started courting, but before they became engaged, my father went deaf. He went completely deaf, which makes it a special delight to see the American Sign Language interpreters today. He was a graduate student. He had no income, or no substantial income, and no great prospects. But he learned to read lips. That was the literacy that he acquired. He learned to read lips. My mother made the decision to marry a deaf man in the 1949. My mother married a deaf man. They wanted a family. They wanted to be able to have children, and think of the courage. Think of the love to take the chance that this deaf man who hadn't finished his education was going to be able to support his family. My father went on to be a highway planner and a geography professor. My mother would go to conferences with him to be his ears. When we were able, my brother and sisters and I also would go to conferences with him to be his ears. So I don't have to look very far to find a story about the power of literacy. Last thoughts. Coming back to the observation I made at the beginning about the fact that you are all already experts at this. So for the rest of the conference, and when you leave the conference, please check to see whether there's any truth to that view that you're already experts, and ask people. Ask if they have noticed you be a caring observer. Ask when, and get them to tell you stories of you being a caring observer. Think about and ask people about when you have been an engineer. And ask people to feed back to you the stories that you've told that have had the most impact on them. Thank you.
Well, that gets us off to a great start. We've had 3 very different perspectives with many common elements. I'm going to kick off the discussion with one question to each panelist, and I'd like you all to be thinking about your questions, and if you're impatient, you could even start heading for the 2 floor mics. I'll begin with you, Rick. Drawing on your experience, what is the largest impediment to change? Is it fear? Is it habit? Is it a lack of awareness that there are better ways to do things? Or all of the above and a few more?